every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There are moments in history, small hinges upon which public sentiment swings, when a single act crystallizes a generation's anxieties. In the autumn of 2015, such a moment arrived not with a bang, but with a price tag. The number was almost cartoonish in its villainy, $5,556. That was the new price for a single pill of a drug called Daraprim. The old price, $13.50. It was a price hike of more than 5,000%. The drug wasn't new. It wasn't a revolutionary cure. It was a 62-year-old medication used to treat a parasitic infection, a lifeline for AIDS patients, cancer patients, and pregnant women with compromised immune systems. Overnight, the architect of this decision, a 32-year-old former hedge fund manager with a boyish smirk named Martin Shkreli, became a household name. He was instantly dubbed the Pharma Bro, a moniker that stuck with the tenacity of a chemical bond. He was labeled the most hated man in America, a title he seemed not just to accept, but to relish. He leaned into the persona, live streaming his life, sneering at journalists, and trolling his critics online with a baffling mixture of high-level biochemical jargon and juvenile insults. He became a living caricature of corporate greed, a symbol of everything wrong with a system that seemed to prioritize profit over people. But the story that captured the world's attention, the story of the Daraprim price hike, was not the crime that would ultimately unravel his empire. That story was merely the loud public symptom of a much deeper pathology. The real crime was quieter, more complex, a labyrinth of falsified documents, phantom investments, and corporate malfeasance that had been festering for years behind the closed doors of Wall Street. Martin Shkreli went to prison not for being a pharmaceutical villain, but for being a common conman. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a uniquely modern crime, a case where the moral outrage was a smokescreen for old-fashioned fraud. We will explore the psychology of a man who seemed to court infamy as a business strategy, and how he built a house of cards so elaborate that its collapse was not a matter of if, but when. This is the anatomy of corporate greed, examined through the strange, confounding, and ultimately criminal career of Martin Shkreli. To understand the man who would become the Pharma Bro, you have to go back to the beginning, to a world far removed from Wall Street penthouses and pharmaceutical boardrooms. Martin Shkreli was born in 1983 in Brooklyn, New York, the son of Albanian and Croatian immigrants who worked as janitors. He and his siblings grew up in a working-class neighborhood, a world of grit and hustle, where the glittering spires of Manhattan were a constant, visible reminder of a different kind of life. From an early age, it was clear Martin was different. He was preternaturally intelligent, with a restless, probing mind that chafed against the rigid structures of a traditional education. He was the kind of student who could ace a test without studying, but couldn't be bothered to do the homework. He skipped so many classes in his final year that his prestigious Manhattan high school, Hunter College High School, refused to grant him a diploma, though he had already completed the coursework required for graduation. He was a paradox, a brilliant mind with an almost pathological aversion to authority and rules. His interests were as eclectic as his personality. He loved science, particularly chemistry, and he developed a passion for rock music, teaching himself to play the guitar. But his true north, the force that would shape his destiny, was the intoxicating world of finance. At just 17 years old, while still in high school, he landed an internship at Kramer Berkowitz and Company, the hedge fund co-founded by the famously volatile television personality, Jim Cramer. Here, in the heart of the financial beast, Shkreli found his calling. He was a natural. He had an innate ability to read the market, to see patterns others missed. He was particularly drawn to the biotechnology sector, where his background in chemistry gave him a distinct edge. He could parse complex clinical trial data and understand the science behind a new drug in a way that most of his peers simply could not. His talent was undeniable. He quickly gained a reputation as a savvy biotech investor, and he recommended short-selling the stock of several drug companies whose medications he believed were destined to fail. When his predictions proved correct and the stocks plummeted, the fund made millions. Jim Cramer himself was impressed, later recalling Shkreli's uncanny ability to sniff out weak companies. But even then, there were whispers. In 2003, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, investigated a bet he made against a company called Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. They suspected he had learned of the company's poor drug trial results before they were made public. The investigation ultimately went nowhere, and no charges were filed, but it was an early sign of a pattern that would come to define his career, a willingness to operate in the gray areas, right on the edge of the rules. After earning a business degree from Baruch College, Shkreli decided it was time to strike out on his own. He was ambitious, brimming with self-confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room, and he wanted to prove it. In 2006, he co-founded his first hedge fund, Elia Capital Management. It was his first taste of being the boss, of calling the shots. It was also his first catastrophic failure. The fund was torpedoed by a bad bet, and in less than a year, it was insolvent. Lehman Brothers later sued Elia for over $2 million for failing to pay for a disastrous trade. The fund collapsed, a humbling experience for a young man who had known little but success. But Martin Shkreli did not see it as a lesson in humility. He saw it as a temporary setback, a problem to be solved, not a failure to be learned from. He dusted himself off, and in 2009, with a new round of funding from new investors, he launched his second venture, MSMB Capital Management. The name was an acronym, a tribute to himself and his partner. This time, he promised, would be different. He was older, wiser, and more determined than ever. And it was here, within the walls of MSMB Capital, that the seeds of his criminal enterprise were truly sown. It started with a single, massive, and spectacularly ill-fated bet against the market. At MSMB Capital, Martin Shkreli employed a high-risk, high-reward strategy. His specialty remained the same: short-selling biotech stocks. To short a stock is to bet on its failure. A traditional short seller borrows shares of a stock they believe is overvalued, immediately sells them on the open market, and then waits for the price to drop. If it does, they buy the shares back at the lower price, return them to the lender, and pocket the difference. It's a legitimate, if often predatory, investment strategy. But Shkreli allegedly engaged in something far riskier, a practice known as naked short selling. In a naked short, the seller doesn't actually borrow the shares before selling them. They simply sell shares they don't have, promising to deliver them later. It's a gamble that the price will fall, allowing them to buy the needed shares cheaply before the settlement date. The potential profit is limited, but the potential loss is, in theory, infinite. If the stock price goes up instead of down, the naked short seller is in a perilous position. forced to buy shares at a higher price to cover their position, a situation known as a short squeeze. In early 2011, Shkreli placed a massive naked short bet against a company called Orexogen Therapeutics. He was convinced its new diet drug would be rejected by the FDA. He sold millions of shares he didn't own, waiting for the inevitable price collapse. But he was wrong. The FDA Advisory Committee voted in favor of the drug, and Orexogen's stock price didn't collapse. It skyrocketed. Shkreli was caught in a brutal short squeeze. The brokerage firm he used, Merrill Lynch, demanded he cover his position. The bill came to a staggering $7 million. MSMB Capital didn't have the money. The fund was effectively wiped out, a smoldering crater of a single bad bet. This was the critical juncture, the moment a financial failure morphed into a federal crime. Instead of admitting defeat, telling his investors their money was gone, and shutting down the fund, Shkreli chose a different path. He chose deception. He began to lie. According to federal prosecutors, he concealed the devastating loss from his investors. He sent them falsified account statements showing that the fund was not only healthy but thriving, reporting handsome, entirely fictitious profits. He claimed to be managing tens of millions of dollars in assets, when in reality the fund's bank account was practically empty. He was running on fumes, but his bravado never wavered. He continued to project an image of success, a financial wunderkind who had the Midas touch, and based on these false pretenses, he convinced new investors to pour more money into his doomed fund. He was no longer just a failed hedge fund manager. He was, in the eyes of the law, the operator of a classic Ponzi-like scheme. He was using new investor money to pay off his old debts and to placate earlier investors who were starting to ask for their money back. It was a desperate, frantic juggling act, a financial shell game where he moved money from one pocket to another, trying to stay one step ahead of total collapse. The pressure was immense. His investors were getting restless. Some were powerful people who were not accustomed to being ignored. They wanted their money, the profits they had been promised, and they wanted it now. Shkreli needed a new plan, a new source of cash, something bigger and more sophisticated than just luring in a few more unsuspecting investors. He needed a publicly traded company, a vehicle he could control with its own treasury and its own stock. He needed a new piggy bank. And so, in 2011, he founded Retrophin, a biotechnology company with a stated mission to develop treatments for rare diseases. It was a noble goal, but for Martin Shkreli, it was also a means to a criminal end. Retrophin was Martin Shkreli's masterstroke, the linchpin of his entire fraudulent scheme. On the surface, it was a legitimate enterprise. He recruited talented scientists and focused on acquiring or developing drugs for rare, neglected diseases, a field known as orphan drugs. This was a clever business model. Orphan drugs can command extremely high prices because they serve small patient populations with few or no alternative treatments, and they face less competition. He successfully took the company public, and for a time, it seemed like a genuine success story. Shkreli was now not just a hedge fund manager, but the CEO of a publicly traded biotech firm. But behind this facade of legitimacy, prosecutors argued, Retrophin was created for a darker purpose, to serve as an instrument to bail out his failed hedge fund, MSMB Capital. Shkreli now had control over a corporate entity with its own assets, cash and stock. The problem was how to get those assets out of Retrophin and into the hands of his angry hedge fund investors without raising red flags. He couldn't just write them a check from the company account. That would be blatant, easily detectable theft. He needed a way to disguise the transfers, to make them look like legitimate business expenses. So he devised a series of sham agreements. He had Retrophin enter into bogus consulting contracts with some of his earliest and most demanding hedge fund investors. These investors, many of whom had no relevant expertise to offer a biotech company, were paid handsome fees for services they never rendered. One investor was paid over $100,000 for a consulting agreement that consisted of a single, 2-page document filled with boilerplate language. Another received payments funneled through the account of an employee's spouse. The money flowed from Retrophin through these sham contracts and was used to settle the investor's claims against the now-defunct MSMB hedge fund. In other instances, he simply used Retrophin stock. He awarded blocks of company shares to aggrieved investors, again, under the guise of settling non-existent claims or paying for fake services. In total, federal prosecutors would later allege that Martin Shkreli misappropriated more than $11 million in cash and stock from Retrophin to pay off the debts of his personal hedge fund. He was treating the publicly traded company, a company with shareholders, and a fiduciary duty, as his own private slush fund, a tool to clean up the mess he had created at MSMB Capital. For a while, the scheme worked. But a company is not a one-man show. It has a board of directors, accountants, and lawyers, and people at Retrophin were starting to notice Shkreli's erratic behavior and questionable financial arrangements. He was a volatile and difficult CEO, prone to angry outbursts and impulsive decisions. The board grew increasingly concerned about his management and the strange payments he was authorizing. They began to ask questions, to push back. They hired an outside law firm to conduct an independent investigation into his activities. Shkreli saw the writing on the wall. The walls were closing in. In September 2014, the board of directors at Retrophin made its move. They ousted him. In a press release, the company announced that Martin Shkreli was stepping down as CEO. The language was sterile and corporate, but the message was clear. He was out. A few days later, the company filed a lawsuit against him, seeking $64 million in damages. The lawsuit laid bare the core of his scheme, accusing him of a long-running and systematic scheme to enrich himself at the company's expense and using Retrophin's assets to pay off his hedge fund investors. The lawsuit was a public declaration of war. It was also a roadmap for federal investigators. The SEC and the Department of Justice, which had likely been monitoring Shkreli for some time, now had a detailed public account of his alleged crimes coming from his own former company. The quiet, complex fraud that Martin Shkreli had spent years constructing was beginning to crumble. He was no longer a CEO. He was a target, and he responded to this existential threat not by laying low, but by doubling down on his own brand of chaotic, aggressive ambition. He founded a new company, Turing Pharmaceuticals, and it was there that he would commit the act that would make him infamous. Freed from the constraints of a board of directors, Martin Shkreli was now the undisputed king of his own castle at Turing Pharmaceuticals. It was a privately held company, giving him the autonomy he craved. He set out to replicate the Retrophin business model, but with a twist. Instead of developing new drugs, he would focus on acquiring old, out-of-patent drugs that were the sole treatment for a particular condition. This was a strategy known as specialty pharma, and it was a niche he understood perfectly. The goal was to find a drug where a single company controlled the entire market, a monopoly hidden in plain sight. In August 2015, he found his perfect target, Daraprim. The drug, whose chemical name is pyrimethamine, had been on the market since 1953. It was the standard of care for treating toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that can be devastating, even fatal, for people with weakened immune systems, such as those with HIV/AIDS or certain cancers. It was also prescribed to pregnant women to prevent the infection from passing to their unborn child. For decades, the drug had been affordable and accessible. The company that owned it before Turing, Impax Laboratories, had sold it for $13.50 a tablet. It was not a major profit center for them. It was simply a reliable, necessary medication. Shkreli saw a golden opportunity. He saw a captive market. Patients who needed Daraprim couldn't simply switch to another drug. There were no effective alternatives. Doctors couldn't prescribe a generic version because Shkreli's company had also locked up the distribution channels, making it nearly impossible for a competitor to acquire the pills needed to perform the FDR-acquired tests. To bring a generic to market, he had created a closed loop, a perfect monopoly. And with that monopoly secured, he made his move. Turing Pharmaceuticals acquired the rights to Daraprim for $55 million. Almost immediately, they announced the new price, $750 per pill. The public reaction was not just negative, it was visceral. The story, first broken by the New York Times, went viral. A price hike of over 5,000% on a life-saving drug seemed to encapsulate a level of greed that was almost beyond comprehension. Medical societies, patient advocacy groups, and politicians from both sides of the aisle erupted in outrage. The Infectious Diseases Society of America and the HIV Medicine Association sent a joint letter to Turing calling the price increase unjustifiable for the medically vulnerable patient population and unsustainable for the healthcare system. Hillary Clinton, then running for president, tweeted that price gouging like this in the specialty drug market is outrageous. Her tweet sent the entire biotech stock index tumbling. Martin Shkreli, instead of retreating or apologizing, walked directly into the firestorm. He went on a media tour, appearing on networks like Bloomberg and CNBC to defend his decision. His performance was a masterclass in defiant arrogance. He smirked, he condescended, he lectured experienced journalists on basic economics. He argued that the previous price was so low that the drug was unprofitable, and that the new, higher price was necessary to fund research and development for better, more advanced treatments for toxoplasmosis. It was a rationale that was immediately picked apart by experts, who pointed out that Daraprim was an old drug that needed little R&D, and that Shkreli's company had done nothing to develop it. His arguments were unconvincing, but it was his demeanor that was truly shocking. He seemed to revel in the negative attention. When asked if he would lower the price, he responded with a smug no. He appeared entirely devoid of empathy for the patients who depended on his product, speaking of them not as people, but as data points in a profit and loss statement. He took to Twitter, his preferred medium, to battle his critics directly. He called one journalist a moron, got into protracted arguments with politicians, and generally behaved less like a CEO and more like an internet troll. He was not just defending a business decision, he was waging a culture war, positioning himself as a free market purist against a world of naive simpletons who didn't understand how business worked. This public spectacle, the birth of the pharma bro, had a dual effect. It made him a national pariah, the face of pharmaceutical avarice. but it also, perversely, distracted from his other, more legally perilous problems. While the world was screaming about Daraprim, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York was quietly building its case against him for the securities fraud he had allegedly committed at MSMB Capital and Retrofin. The Daraprim scandal had made him famous, but it was the ghosts of his past that were about to bring him down. He had become the most hated man in America, and in doing so, he had painted an enormous target on his own back. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 17, 2015, while Martin Shkreli was likely asleep in his Manhattan apartment, a team of FBI agents was assembling outside. For months, federal prosecutors had been methodically piecing together the puzzle of his financial past. They had pored over Retrofin's internal documents, interviewed the company's board members, and subpoenaed records from his investors. They had traced the flow of money from the public company to the private hedge fund, following the trail of sham consulting agreements and questionable stock transfers. They believed they had more than enough to prove that Shkreli had run his companies not as legitimate businesses, but as a personal piggy bank to cover his own failures. The raid was swift and professional. Agents entered his apartment, and a bleary-eyed Martin Shkreli, clad in a hoodie, was taken into custody. Photos of the perp walk flashed across the internet within hours, showing the infamous Pharma Bro, his hands cuffed behind his back, looking more bewildered than defiant. He was charged in a 7-count federal indictment that included securities fraud and wire fraud conspiracy. The charges had nothing to do with the Daraprim price hike. That act, while morally repugnant to many, was not in itself illegal. The crimes he was accused of were the far more conventional, if complex, sins of lying to investors and looting a public company. The indictment alleged that Shkreli had engaged in a web of lies and deceit. It detailed how he had lost all the money in his hedge fund, MSMB Capital, and then lied to his investors about it. It described how he then raised money for another fund, MSMB Healthcare, on the false pretense that it was a successful enterprise with tens of millions in assets. Finally, it laid out the scheme to use his next company, Retrofin, to pay back his old investors with stolen cash and stock. It was, in the words of U.S. Attorney Robert Capers, a Ponzi-like scheme where he used each subsequent entity to pay off defrauded investors from the prior entity. Shkreli was released on a $5 million bond, and if the public expected the arrest to chasten him, they were sorely mistaken. He immediately reverted to his familiar persona. He resigned as CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals, but did not disappear from public life. He began live streaming from his apartment for hours on end, playing video games, giving unsolicited financial advice, and rambling about his case. He treated the serious federal charges against him as a minor annoyance, a misunderstanding perpetrated by incompetent government lawyers. He proclaimed his innocence to anyone who would listen, insisting that his only crime was being flamboyant and eccentric. His legal team, led by the renowned defense attorney Benjamin Brafman, who had previously represented figures like Sean Diddy Combs and Dominique Strauss-Kahn, adopted a more sober approach. Their defense strategy began to take shape, and it was a novel one. They didn't dispute many of the facts of the case. They didn't deny that Shkreli had made misrepresentations to his investors, or that he had used Retrofin assets to pay them back. Instead, they planned to argue a no-harm, no-foul defense. Their central claim was that in the end, none of his investors had actually lost money. In fact, thanks to the soaring value of their Retrofin stock, Many of them had walked away with substantial profits. Therefore, Braffman would argue, no actual fraud had been committed. It was a bold strategy to concede the act but deny the crime, framing Shkreli not as a con man, but as an unconventional genius whose unorthodox methods ultimately made everyone rich. The stage was set for one of the most bizarre and closely watched white-collar crime trials in recent memory. The trial of Martin Shkreli began in the summer of 2017, and from the very first day, it was a spectacle. The central challenge for the court was finding a jury. Shkreli's pretrial infamy, largely due to the Daraprim scandal, had made him such a polarizing figure that finding 12 impartial citizens seemed like an impossible task. During jury selection, prospective jurors did not hold back. One called him the face of corporate greed. Another said he was the most hated man in America. One juror was dismissed after stating, "I don't like this person at all. I think he's a greedy little man." Yet another simply said, "He disrespected the Wu-Tang Clan," a reference to Shkreli's purchase of the single copy album Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, which he had refused to release publicly. The legal arguments that followed were a clash of two fundamentally different narratives. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jacqueline Kasoulis, painted a simple picture of a common criminal. They argued that Shkreli was a liar and a cheat who had run a classic Ponzi-like scheme. They presented a mountain of evidence, emails where Shkreli placated nervous investors with false promises, documents detailing the sham consulting agreements, and testimony from former Retrofin board members and the investors he had deceived. Their argument was clear. Fraud is fraud, regardless of the outcome. The law, they insisted, cares about the dishonest act itself, not whether the victims eventually got their money back through sheer luck or a rising stock market. Benjamin Braffman, for the defense, countered with a portrait of Shkreli as a misunderstood genius. He argued that his client was a brilliant but socially awkward eccentric, a maverick who didn't play by the conventional rules of Wall Street. Braffman described him as a kid who in many respects is a genius, but who sometimes had a failure to communicate. He insisted that Shkreli never intended to defraud anyone. His only goal, Braffman claimed, was to make his investors money, and he had succeeded spectacularly. He paraded a series of those investors before the jury, many of whom admitted on the stand that, despite Shkreli's misrepresentations, they had ultimately made millions from their investments with him. The defense's message was simple. Where are the victims? How can this be a crime if everyone got rich? Throughout the trial, the defendant himself was a constant source of disruption. Despite his lawyers' desperate pleas for him to remain silent, Shkreli could not help himself. He held impromptu press conferences in the hallways of the courthouse, where he derided the prosecutors as the junior varsity. He took to Facebook to post commentary on the case and mock the government's witnesses. He was, in effect, providing a running, contemptuous commentary on his own federal trial, a move that infuriated both the prosecution and the judge. After 5 weeks of testimony and 5 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. It was a split decision. They found Martin Shkreli guilty on 3 of the 8 counts against him, 2 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit securities fraud. He was acquitted on 5 other charges, including the most serious counts of wire fraud conspiracy related to the Retrofin shell game. It was a partial victory for both sides. The prosecution had secured a conviction, proving that his lies to investors were, in fact, a federal crime. The defense could claim that the jury had rejected the government's broader narrative that he had looted his own company. Shkreli, ever the showman, declared the verdict a witch hunt of epic proportions. He was a convicted felon, but he was still free on bail, awaiting sentencing, and his capacity for self-sabotage was far from exhausted. With the guilty verdict secured, Martin Shkreli was facing a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison, but he was still free on his $5 million bond, and his behavior grew even more erratic. He seemed to view his conviction not as a moment for sober reflection, but as a license for further provocation. Just a month after the verdict, he made a post on Facebook that would prove to be his undoing. He offered his followers a $5,000 reward for a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair to be obtained during her upcoming book tour. He claimed it was satire, a joke, but federal prosecutors and the Secret Service saw it differently. They saw it as a credible threat, a solicitation of assault against a former First Lady and Secretary of State. Prosecutors immediately filed a motion to have his bail revoked, arguing that his increasingly bizarre and menacing online behavior proved he was a danger to the community. At the hearing, Judge Kyo Matsumoto agreed. She admonished Shkreli directly, stating that his post was not a joke but a solicitation to commit a crime. "This is not a counsel-at-an-error client," she said, rejecting the defense's apologies. "He is a danger to the community." And with that, Martin Shkreli was taken back into custody. He was sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a notoriously rough federal jail, to await his sentencing. The smirking, trolling pharma bro was now simply inmate number 87,850,053. On March 9, 2018, he appeared for sentencing. His lawyers pleaded for leniency, asking for a sentence of just 12 to 18 months. They argued again that his investors had suffered no financial losses. They even presented letters from Shkreli's supporters and a report from a psychologist who diagnosed him with social awkwardness. For the first time, Shkreli himself seemed to show a glimmer of remorse. He broke down in tears as he addressed the court, apologizing to his investors and saying, "I was a fool. I should have known better." He spoke of his shame and the humiliation he had brought upon his family. The prosecution, however, argued for a sentence of 15 years or more. They portrayed his tears as just another performance, another manipulation. They reminded the judge of his long history of lies, his lack of genuine remorse, and his contempt for the legal system he had mocked throughout his trial. Judge Matsumoto ultimately settled on a sentence that split the difference. She sentenced Martin Shkreli to 7 years in federal prison and ordered him to forfeit more than $7.3 million in assets. Among those assets was the one-of-a-kind Wu-Tang Clan album he had so famously purchased. Shkreli served his time in a low-security federal prison in Pennsylvania. His life behind bars was, by most accounts, a continuation of his life outside it, albeit in a more constrained environment. He reportedly tried to continue running his pharmaceutical business from a contraband cell phone, and was eventually sent to solitary confinement for it. He was released from prison early in May of 2022 to serve the remainder of his sentence in a halfway house. He immediately returned to social media, launching a new venture in the equally volatile world of cryptocurrency and Web3 technology. The pharma bro was back, seemingly unchanged by his time in prison, still projecting the same image of defiant, misunderstood genius. In the end, what is the true anatomy of this crime? Martin Shkreli's case is a strange and unsettling portrait of greed in the 21st century. The crime that made him infamous, the Daraprim price hike, was technically legal, a grotesque but permissible function of a market system that allows for such maneuvers. The crime that sent him to prison, securities fraud, was a classic, almost old-fashioned con, dressed up in the complex language of hedge funds and biotechnology. He lied to his investors to cover his losses, then used a public company to clean up the mess. It was a scheme born not of financial sophistication, but of simple, desperate dishonesty. But the real core of the Shkreli anatomy isn't just about financial mechanics. It is about the pathology of contempt. He displayed a profound contempt for his investors, whom he saw as marks to be manipulated. He showed contempt for the patients who needed his drugs, viewing them as mere revenue streams. He had contempt for the media, the legal system, and any form of authority that dared to question him. His greatest innovation was not in finance or medicine, but in public villainy. He weaponized his own infamy, seemingly believing that if he could control the narrative, he could control reality itself. Martin Shkreli was not an anomaly. He was an amplification. He was the product of a culture that can sometimes confuse arrogance with genius, and wealth with virtue. He held up a mirror to the ugliest parts of the financial and pharmaceutical industries. And what we saw was so unsettling that we collectively branded him a monster. But his true crime was not that he broke the rules of the system. It was that he exposed them, shamelessly and with a smirk. His story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Is the most hated man in America a singular villain, or is he just the one who was brazen enough to say the quiet part out loud? This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.